And I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, say a little bit about themselves, and also possibly touch on what they feel are the big barriers to success. Starting with Gavin.
Sure. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Gavin Lewis. I'm head of UK LGPS. That's the local government pension scheme at BlackRock. I was born on a council estate in Tottenham in a single-parent family, and I had an interesting childhood where I had to navigate some of the things you may have read about in the press, so knife crime, overt racism. But yeah, I find myself sitting in a seat where I'm a managing director at BlackRock, which in itself has been pretty amazing for me, but then when I look around, there was no one else like me. So things that I do, I try to raise awareness of the issues, and I work hard to try and bring people from my background into the industry. So Talk About Black and the Diversity Project are at the forefront of that.
Thank you. Sarah?
So I'm Sarah Smart. I'm a non-executive director at the Pensions Regulator and independent member of the Investment Committee at Unilever. I classify myself as an independent trustee and non-executive director. And in fact, I'm the senior independent director at TPR, which often raises eyebrows with people when they look at me. How can that title attribute to you? And I don't feel that I have many particularly diverse characteristics as a candidate in some of the roles I put myself up for. Yes, I'm female, but I come from a very, traditional, quite privileged background, public school, and an early career. And the difference for me perhaps isn't so much that I'm a woman, but some of the over-ageism that is within our industry, and I think generally within sort of non-exec and trustee roles. I was 35 when I moved into doing this sort of work and was openly told, Sarah, we're looking for someone who's got 30 years experience in the city, or you're just at the start of your career, it's not appropriate for you to do this sort of thing. And for me, that's just a typification of the fact that in order to really address the issues with diversity, we have to look beyond what someone has on their background, what's on their CV, and really understand what skills we're looking for people to bring and how we can test for whether they do bring those skills.
Perfect. Daniel?
I'm Daniel Gerring. I'm a lawyer, head up the pensions practice at Travers Smith. I also sit on a number of trustee boards, but they are charity trustee boards, including chairing the board of a charity called Just Like Us, which is the national charity for young LGBT people. But I was very struck by what Sayeeda said and her 5 questions, because actually what I think when you come to all of this is that much more important than my job or my volunteering or whatever it might be is my background. And so you look at me and you're saying, okay, there's a relatively posh white man in a suit. What you don't necessarily immediately think is, oh, that's a gay man. You certainly probably don't then think, oh, well, that's a gay man with significant caring responsibilities for a mother with premature Alzheimer's. And you probably don't then go on and think, oh, necessarily, nowadays, well, that's a Christian. And actually, interestingly, I find it often more difficult coming out as a Christian than coming out as a gay man. So, that really resonated with me. And I think being involved and having been involved for many years, advising boards, sitting on all sorts of different committees, taking the time to actually try and understand what we each have to offer. That's talking about people who are already on those committees, boards, whatever they might be, but also doing the same thing in a recruitment process and being genuinely open-minded about it will be the thing that changes things and moves the dial. And I guess, again, going back to something that Sayeeda said, my sort of key sort of takeaway from what I've learned about D&I, and but also about effective decision making and getting the best outcomes for our members, is to avoid this defensiveness. And I go to board meetings and we have conversations about this, and I immediately see people leaning back in their chairs and just saying, oh, this isn't relevant, because what's relevant is the best outcome for our members in terms of financial returns. And what you'll see in this guide, which we published today, is plenty of evidence which shows that across, not just across the asset managers, but across the people who are actually making the decisions, let's say the boards, sponsors, and other key players, getting D&I there and getting a range of people and avoiding a groupthink mentality will deliver better outcomes for our members. And that's why I'm passionate about this and why I'm here.
Thank you. And so before we jump into some of the questions, I think what's really interesting is through everything that everyone is saying here today, inclusiveness is key. And the conversation about diversity is happening in the industry. But you've all shared with me also examples of how inclusion is actually stopping us from really reaching our goals. Be that people don't want to come into the industry because of the fact they don't think they're welcome, there's not the right role models, or the fact that when they're in, they're made to feel uncomfortable in the positions that they're in. Can we maybe just touch on this and maybe bring out some of the examples that you've shared before? Sarah, you've got a very good one. And just let's help the audience to understand how we can maybe get over this rather significant hurdle to take a step forward.
Yeah, we had a really good example recently at Unilever. We were conscious that we wanted to increase the diversity of people around the table, but particularly to hear more of a younger voice and people who could connect more with the members of the scheme. So we were very lucky. The sponsor provided us with a younger female who was in the communication department, who came and joined the trustee board. And unfortunately, that appointment didn't last for very long. She didn't stay with us for very long, just under a year. A number of different reasons, but one of the ones she cited was the fact that there's a huge amount of work going on at Unilever to how they work in an agile fashion, and younger people sort of work in a very flexible way. And that's what young people within that community, how they're used to working. And then she came into our board environment where we have all day long trustee meetings, extremely formal, huge papers, which is like, I can't work in this environment. And so I think, we have to understand, if we want to bring different people into the boardroom, how they like to work, how we're going to really get the best out of them and change our working practices to accommodate them.
Mm-hmm. Gavin, you've got similar issues that you've faced in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sayeeda put it quite aptly, is that the challenge with this whole D&I thing is it's become, so everybody has to do it. And every organisation or entity feels that they now have to have a D&I policy or a strategy. So what typically happens is that you might hire a head of D&I, or you might put some principles down, and then you start hiring diverse candidates because you kind of have to. And what typically happens is those candidates are brought into your business, and we expect them, or you expect them, to conform to the culture of the organisation. If you're, if you're white and middle class and you work in those organisations, it feels like home to you. If you're not, and it could be any diversifying characteristic, you have to work incredibly hard to fit in or feel like you fit in. And it means actually coming to work every day and almost wearing a mask. But we rarely find that organisations take that on board and try and flex or adapt to those diverse candidates. So what happens is they feel alienated and they end up leaving. So you have a much higher rate of attrition in your ethnic minority candidates or employees, and your LGBTQ employees. So, Daniel came out as a gay man and a Christian. A few years ago, I came out as a black man because I hadn't publicly acknowledged the fact that I was. So I wrote an article on LinkedIn and put it out there. Honestly, because I was tired of wearing a mask and pretending to be something that I wasn't. The reaction has been incredibly interesting. 99.9%, it's been positive. And the really interesting thing is that it's not just black people, right? So I now have the most intimate conversations with people from all walks of life, and many will be white, on the surface look like white middle class males, but then they'll sit down and tell me that, well, actually, their father left them as well, and they grew up in Cornwall, which is a really, really rough place to grow up, and they don't feel like they belong. So what we've done as an industry is that we have this like corporate veneer that everybody must wear. And it's not just people like me that you're alienating and you're not getting the best out of. It's actually everyone.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? What does it mean to be you? Do you remember when we were speaking, you said that we all portray an image. What do you think it means to be you?
So I'll give you an example. So I am 6'3", I have a very deep voice. When I walk into a room, people notice me. The fact that I'm black only adds to the fact that people notice me. And I'm also aware that there are stereotypes of people who look, walk, and sound like me. And if I'm not wearing a suit, then I would look like some of those people that you might read about in the newspaper. I'm also aware that for many people that I work with, I'm probably the only black person that they know or have ever spent any time with. Now, rightly or wrongly, I then feel this huge pressure to be almost perfect, to undo the stereotypes that they probably harbour somewhere deep inside their psyche, but also because inadvertently I'm now representing all the black people that they might also have. So I, for example, feel that I have to be very smiley, I have to be very, very positive. Someone can shout at me, but if I was to shout back, not that I would condone that in the workplace, but let's just say I was to shout back or raise my voice, you're immediately called aggressive or intimidating. It would be, to be me, would not have to act. And it doesn't mean that the real me is really aggressive. But it would just be nice to be able to operate in a place where I'm not constantly watching my mannerisms, how I'm interacting with people and how people are interacting with me. That's what it means to be me.
Yeah, okay. So you're sort of nodding. Do you resonate with what you're hearing?
Yeah, and I think probably more recently because the big debate around religion has been so pronounced, and specifically around Muslims has been so pronounced, and therefore you kind of feel like you're an ambassador for every Muslim in the world, and therefore have to one, deal with all the negative stereotypes and convince people that you're not going to blow them up, or you're not sexually deviant, or you're not violent, or the other extreme where you're not a disempowered woman who all of this stuff. The kind of stereotypes are fascinating, and I gave an example. I was talking to colleagues earlier that the House of Lords votes quite late often, and on one occasion we were voting quite late and we were in the division lobbies. It was past midnight, and a really well-meaning colleague who actually used to be an ex-member of Parliament for quite a diverse constituency, and I'm not sure whether he thought he was being funny or what it was, but he said to me, "And how do you feel that the menfolk in your community would feel about a woman like you being unaccompanied this late at night, surrounded by so many men?" And I kind of tried to unpick that. So, is he being sexist? Is he being funny? Is he being racist? Is he kind of talking to... And it was just so much was going on. I just remember thinking at that point, how do I even start to kind of unpick this? And I hope people aren't offended when I use this term, because a term that I use quite a lot now, and I was talking earlier, it was far easier when people came up to you and just said, Packy or N-word or whatever it was. And so I often now will say to people, look, call me a Packy, it's far easier. I can't deal with the complications of sophisticated racism. It's really hard to find sensible answers. And so I turned to this colleague of mine and I put my hand on his shoulder. I felt I needed to do that to kind of tactile. And I said, and considering like the average age in the House of Lords is 69, but there's lots of people over the age of 80 and 90, I said, look, I think if the men in the community were looking at me right now, surrounded by all of you, they wouldn't be the slightest bit worried, because I don't think any of you could do me any damage whatsoever. And I think it was the only way of kind of being deeply sexist and ageist back to kind of deal with what I kind of felt. So I think there is a lot of pressure. And again, very similar, the reason I was nodding is because you do a lot of smiling, you use a lot of humor, you do, and I think it's that whole sense of I have to be a bigger, better, kinder, whiter than white person than anybody else to kind of project and deal with some of those challenges around stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. Daniel, tell us about your experiences and what's it like to be you, apart from busy?
Yes. No, I mean, that really resonates. And, one of my very good friends from university who's a senior executive, he said, it's all right for you because, you really are the acceptable face of gay, aren't you? And I sort of, it does come back to that because, actually, probably in some respects, I am. I'm not very challenging. I don't tend to wear sort of pink tight T-shirts very often. And, when I walk into a room, I look broadly the same as most people. But I think, and I really would sort of echo the other point which Gavin made around this sort of concept of wearing a mask and being inauthentic. I haven't done that. I've always been myself for a very long time, and I absolutely believe that it's one of the factors that drives individuals in being successful. But one of the things I would say is that does take quite a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of energy, and that's something we should just be aware of. Going back to outcomes for members, the thing that I want to say is with all of these different heads of diversity, it doesn't matter to me which one we're talking about, going back to hierarchy. I totally get it's harder for some people in different situations. That's absolutely right, and it flexes according to the situation. But what this industry is missing out on, if it does not change, is a great talent pool and a great potential to make impact on member outcomes. And I mean that at trustee level, I mean that at asset manager level, I mean that in terms of other advisors. And I think it's true of age. What Sarah said absolutely resonates with me. And I've been doing this for nearly 20 years, and I still get, oh no, I did a pitch process recently, and the feedback was that I didn't have sufficient experience. We were down to the last two, and the other firm was a very good firm and didn't have sufficient experience. And what they were pitching for was my absolute bread and butter. I can do it. Sort of. Standing on my head, and actually, I think I've been really well suited to that. And you don't have sufficient experience after 20 years. The other thing you get sometimes in being me, and I've only really noticed it since we've kind of gone with the D&I thing more heavily in sort of pitch material and other things, is some stuff around, is this person going to be robust enough? And I really, really struggle to understand what that could come to, because believe me, a more robust, respectfully robust lawyer you could not come across. And then I thought, suddenly one day, I know what this is. This is a stereotype about what a gay man might be like, and whether or not they're going to keep their cool. And these kind of, I get these sort of in the banter bit, the kind of Queenie comments, and I just thought there is no other explanation for that. And actually, funnily enough, in that particular, the most recent example of this, a few months later, I was talking to a colleague, because we were actually doing this work, it just wasn't me, and he shared a story of somebody from this board who had described someone, and I'll say it because I think it's good to call it out. This person had described someone as being like the nigger in the woodpile. And I thought, yeah, okay, they're obviously racist and homophobic. So I'm not actually all that sad that I didn't get that appointment, because I don't think I would have found it the most rewarding job of my life. But what I care about fundamentally there is the thousands of people who are relying on those individuals to look after their retirement savings. And I hope that they will move on and actually look to the broadest possible pool of talent to help them with that job.
Thank you.
Can I just add something as well, Danny? Because I think what Sayeeda and Danny have both said is that how you define prejudice now is incredibly hard, because as a society, people think that we now live in this post-racial, post-homophobic, post-sexist society, because it looks like, it's very, very stabby, it's the N-word, and actually it's become a lot more sophisticated than that. Yeah. So for the people on the receiving end, it's incredibly difficult, because before you even get to what's happened, you have to prove that what happened was a problem in the first place. I've had experiences where I've had to call things out, and by the way, it's exhausting doing that. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of energy. But I feel that if I don't do it, someone younger who or more junior won't be able to do the same thing. And on many occasions, saying that someone has been racist or prejudiced, they've almost broken down in tears. And I've ended up having to say, console them around the fact. It's like calling someone racist is worse than the racism itself. That's where we've got to. And I think we have to acknowledge as a society that our history or immigration, the experience that we've had, we've never really dealt with this as a society. The lid got lifted a few years ago during the Brexit vote, because suddenly you were able to say these things, and attacks, homophobia went through the roof, sexism went through the roof, and so did racism. So perhaps the first we need to do is acknowledge that actually, as a society, there are things that we need to deal with, and let's just be honest about it.
And I think just listening to all of this, there's on many levels that I can't totally relate to it, but I think hearing it, and as a chair, and I've chaired a number of organisations, just understanding that there are people, if you're bringing diverse people into your organisation and onto your board who you want to be able to contribute in the best way, thinking that they're having to deal with all of these things at the same time as then having to read all the really complicated stuff and make decisions on it is a hugely challenging task for them. And I think one of our real barriers to really making diversity and inclusion work is the quality, frankly, of chairship that we have in a number of organisations. And again, it's about, if we're going to really make this work, let's recruit the chairs that can really understand how important this is and create an environment where this works, and only then will we start to get the benefit of this.
Okay, and bringing that through a little bit and tying in some of the questions that we're starting to get is that, how do we do that? So acknowledging the fact that sometimes people's actions, they don't mean to be racist or sexist or ageist, and I've had it the same, and I agree. Calling things out is exhausting and embarrassing and difficult, and it's a whole host of wasted energy that could be diverted somewhere else. Acknowledging the fact that we know that there is talent to pull through, right? And we want to create role models to create this better environment. But with boards that serve such long tenures, how do we create that change? How do we help boards want to make that change where appropriate, because we're acknowledging it's not always appropriate, and bring through those skills? How do we start to think about the changes?
Well, I mean, I'll answer it in a sort of lawyer answer. Think about, so let's think about it on two fronts. Firstly, the member-nominated trustee process. This is addressed to some extent in the guide, and I would refer you to it. But there's plenty of evidence which shows that certain groups of people, in particular minority groups and women, will respond less favourably to an election process than men will. And so I think a very obvious starting point would be to have a look at your MNT policy. You might already do selection. You might be completely wedded to an election process. I'm not saying you should necessarily change that. I think you should be open-minded about it and think about it. But then, regardless of what you decide to do, look at your comms. Look at how you communicate the role to people, and think about what it is that's going to turn people off, and think about what it is that is actually going to be more likely to attract talent. Likewise, I think trustee boards should be challenging the sponsor on this. The sponsor, after all, has the ability to appoint normally up to 2/3 of the board. I went to a board meeting recently. I saw some of my clients here today from that trustee board, and I was rolled out to talk about diversity and inclusion. And somebody on the board quite rightly said, well, yes, we are all white men, and most of us are aged over 60. But, why should we change our MND arrangements if the sponsor's not doing anything about it? And I said, well, you could set a good example to them, but yeah, fair point. Go back and talk to them, though.
When I was chair of TPT, we on our trustee election processes then. We used to have a pre-election day, and some of the people who were interested came forward. And there was a good diverse range, but some of the people were from African backgrounds, and they had African names which were difficult to read. And I had, by chance, recently read some stuff in the press that said people automatically, gravitate to names that they can read and understand rather than other names. And I thought, well, this is going to be discriminatory on the ballots that we put. And so I put a proposal to the trustee board that we have blind or no names on the list, just candidate A, candidate B. Well, that was an interesting discussion, but it did actually win the day in the end that we went forward with no names on the ballot list. Now, of course, we didn't run the ballot with names and then without names to see whether we would have got a different result. But we had formal complaints from people saying, we phoned up and said, I don't know who it is because I don't want to vote for a woman. Which for me was kind of the point. And I think, so doing those sort of things and actually having the courage to face out some of the reaction that you will get is very important. We're having a discussion in another fora as well. I think there are obviously biases in selection processes, and people are nervous about moving to selection because of that. But at least you can see them and understand them a bit more and try and control for them. Whereas in election processes, you have no control over the biases that people are subject to when they're making their choices.
Yeah, and I'll take a slightly different tact again. So clearly I work for a fund manager, so a lot of the work that I do is with the fund management industry. And interesting, when we meet asset owners, they're very concerned about diversity and inclusion. And one of the questions which is asked is what's going to be the catalyst for change? And to my mind, there are probably three areas that it will come from. The first is that companies have this light bulb moment and realize that actually this is good for our business, good for our clients and customers, and it's the right thing to do. Some companies do get there, but not the majority. The second is that it's actually mandated. So the regulator will say, actually, you need to be more diverse as an industry, and we're going to put a target in place. People recoil in horror when they hear that for understandable reasons. But the third is that our clients demand it. So when I meet asset owners and they talk about this, I say to them, well, it's great. I mean, you can, to use again Daniel's term, you can wheel me out and stick me on the panel and have me come and do a talk at your organisation. To the asset owners, you have the power, because if you start demanding greater diversity across the value chain, so you think about the counterparties from your sponsor to your fund manager to your fund administrator to your custodian, if you demand greater diversity, people will respond because you have the power. The discussions around sustainability, it began with people caring about the environment. It's ended with this huge focus on ESG and sustainability, because our clients said, you need to the industry, you need to do better. So if you want to see real change, it kind of starts with us, but really ends with you.
And let's be clear, the ESG is ESG, G, governance. We're talking about governance. We're talking about good governance, effective decision making. And it's important that this doesn't get lost within that narrative, and it is getting rather lost within that narrative right now.
Okay, we've got so many questions. I thought maybe what we'll do is just work our way through some of them. We have, oh my goodness, it's disappeared. Here we go. Crazy tech moment. First one, which I actually think is quite interesting for Sayeeda, it says, given the story that you told about your colleague and their comments about your walking home at night or being around men, did you ever see it from their point of view to think that possibly they were trying to understand and recognise and be sympathetic to your culture?
I suppose it depends on what my culture is. We start from so again, this is a really quick potted history. Granddad came here in '58. Dad arrived in 62. I was born here. My kids were born here. My grandkids were born here. At what point does I mean, culture is really the space in which you exist based upon heritage and experiences. And which is why when I asked you at the beginning, how would you see me? I mean, you know, you'll have heard this question, and specifically, I get it all the time from the media. Are you British first or are you Muslim first? And I always say, well, I'm Yorkshire before both. So culturally, if there was anywhere where I was culturally rooted, I would say it's Yorkshire. It's kind of what drives the way I am, the way I speak, the way I see things, how tactile, how friendly I am with people, my sense of humour, the tea I drink, you know, everything may come from the East British Yorkshire tea that I like. So I think in that sense, for me, I think people make assumptions about you when they don't know the real you, which is why I asked the questions right at the beginning. What you think you're engaging with. And what the gentleman had said to me was not walking home. He said, how do you think they would feel about you mixing with so many men late at night? So it wasn't about my safety. He was basically saying to me that I am going to assume that you come from a society where as a woman you are not allowed to mix with other men, and you will be told what to do by the men, whoever the men may be in the community, whoever the community may be. So, you know, I have incredibly frank conversations, which is why I said, look, you know, start from a position of being on the front foot, don't be defensive. Would have no issues with a colleague coming up to me and saying, you know, I read an article on this, Sayeeda. I'd really like to understand what this debate is about. And what I find fascinating, and increasingly it goes to this kind of, are we in a post kind of prejudice era? I have known misogynists to be so concerned about women's rights when it comes to Muslim women. I have known homophobes to be so concerned about gay rights when it comes to Muslim communities. So to me, that is not somebody who's committed to equality. That is somebody who's trying to say they're committed to one equality to be unequal to someone else. And that kind of sophisticated kind of prejudice, I think we have to challenge, and stereotypes we have to challenge. And, you know, what I find increasingly in politics now, for example, is that people will say, oh, you're very outspoken, you can be difficult, she can be difficult to work with, she's not a team player. And one of the arguments I say is I have never heard so many men talk about how it's important for the poor Asian woman to be empowered and liberated until they meet a liberated, empowered Asian woman, and they can't hack it. So I just think we've got to start calling out what we see as this kind of sophisticated concern around equality as well. I can't be a racist because I like gay people. I can't be a homophobe because I've got a black friend. You know, I can't be anti-Muslim because I actually have, you know, I fight for women's rights. I think that kind of stuff has got to be called out, and we've got to say you can't just cling. And that's why I said, you know, for somebody who'd spent her whole life campaigning on racial justice, you know, in 2004-5, I fundamentally messed up and got completely wrong the issue of LGBT rights. And at that time, I was already in the public domain, and it would have been so easy just to say, well, you know, I'm such an equality fighter, I can't get this wrong. Instead, I stood back. I went away, I listened, I talked, I actually made great friends, and then went on my own journey before I then said I was sorry, because it would have been easy to just say, oh, I got that wrong, sorry, let's move on. I needed to understand why I was wrong, and then learn from that, and then do something about it. And actually become, you know, you've got, I think if somebody ever says to you, or if you're ever found to be wanting on the issue of racism, don't just say, well, from now onwards, I'll be careful about not being racist. I think you then have to go the full journey and be an anti-racist. Yeah. It's not good enough to be a bystander, I think, on issues like this. And if we genuinely care about them, I think we'll do something active and positive about change, rather than just saying, well, I messed up and I'll try not to mess up in the future.
And it brings through another question here, actually, about do we need to recognise that people are different, or do we need to act on those differences? So what are we really trying to achieve here? Is it, if we recognise it, it's enough because it will come through in our behaviours, or do we need to act on it? And I assume when we say act, it possibly means also bringing through the conversation about targets and various things like that?
I mean, to a certain extent, I think it's almost like we don't want to recognise anyone's different because we want to recognise everybody for who they are, not because they are different. But I do think that, you know, as we've talked about beforehand, if we sort of just say that and that's okay, then we won't actually move anything forward. And I do think everyone will talk about what we're trying to achieve is cognitive diversity and diversity of thought. But you can't see that, and it's very difficult to measure it, and it's actually very difficult to really put what you think back and say, I'm going to try and recruit someone who thinks really differently from me, because that's very challenging. So I think a first step towards it is to get a group of people in the room who do look and different to each other and sound different from each other and come from different places.
I'm going to be a bit controversial here as well. Fundamentally, that whole philosophy will put people will get worried they're about to lose their jobs, right? Especially on boards, we have protectivism, we have defensive natures. Do we think that is one of the barriers that is stopping the change? People being shown?
Yes, I do. I think that actually, and you know, this is controversial, but I think people do need to consider what, in the pensions context, what is going to drive the best member outcome. Why am I on a board? I'm on a board because I want to do the best thing for my members. I'm not on the board because I want to be on a board. And if you can get to that point, then I think we will lose a barrier. And I just want to pick up on something that's been said. To answer the question that was posed directly, we have to treat people differently. It's very clear. I'll give you a brief example. A friend at work, a colleague, senior colleague, and I were having a challenging conversation about this, about some of his behaviours. And he said, but I just treat everyone the same. And I said, okay, just talk me through what it looks like. We were talking about a transaction, they were all there in the middle of the night. What does your woman like? Oh, you know, we're talking about stuff. What are you talking about? Well, eventually got down to it. Well, you know, when in the breaks we talk about football, and I said, well, you know, that's probably fine with some people, but have you considered that actually that person we're talking about, who happened to be a gay black man, you know, isn't interested in football? And there was a little bit of a light bulb moment, because he's not a bad person, he's a great person. He just honestly thought, well, if I treat everyone the same as I've always treated everyone who's always been in my room, then it'll be fine. It's not. We have to change the way we engage. And it goes back to what Sarah said about effective chairing. That is a fundamental responsibility of any trustee, but particularly a chair, to look at the different people in the room, whether it's advisors, fellow trustees, and people who they are entrusting their money with, and try and get the best out of them.
And on your second point, to the question, if we've interpreted it correctly, organisations and entities need to be purposeful about this. So you have to put some type of programme in place. If you'd have asked me a few years ago, do I believe in quotas and etc., I would have said no, because I don't want to be seen as part of a quota. I'm here on merit. And I still actually maintain that quotas are probably not the right thing for our industry. But because we don't understand quotas, like as an industry, it's not a metric that we typically use, but we do understand targets. Like every board, right? It's something that we understand. So you put a target in front of a board or a company or organisation, and it's something they can achieve, then I think you'll start to see change.
Yeah, I can comply and explain. Well, I think you have to have you know, we do this in lots of things in this industry, right? Comply or explain target.
Yeah.
You know, it may be you don't reach your target. Well, why?
And what are you doing about it?
And I don't believe people should be sitting on trustee boards for 20 years. You know, they may be very good at the job, but the job changes and you need fresh ideas and stuff. And I think, you know, there should be a natural turnover, and so there should be places coming up that can be filled by different people, and there should be naturally people stepping off. It's not about people losing their jobs and they're getting protectionism. You know, recognise that you'll do your turn for a period and then let someone else come in and have a different view.
Perfect. Okay, a little of an easier one, just to lighten the mood before we go into some of the final questions. What is your badge? What does it represent?
It is a little roof with a chimney, and it represents a charity which I helped set up, and the board of which I sit on, called Refugees at Home. Very simple idea. Lots of people are upset about refugees and asylum seekers. Some people want to do something about it, we set up a charity which is like free Airbnb for refugees and asylum seekers. So you can have someone in your house if you want. I've got a Sudanese chap living with me. I've had a number of people. I had an Iranian dentist as well, very helpful. And we've provided over 150,000 nights of free accommodation since we set up just over 3 years ago.
Amazing.
Many things. So we do have an awful lot of questions, and we are going to make sure that the panel answers these after today, because there are so very many of them, and the conversation has been so thought-provoking. But I think in order for us to maybe start to wrap up the session and really get some proactive elements that the audience can take away with them, a couple of things, maybe if we just get your thoughts down the line of, firstly, what do you think we do about when we do get different personalities in the board and we have different people in the room? How do we manage that?
Well, I think it does come back to good chairing. It comes back to actually wanting to listen. And if we actually do genuinely listen to people rather than just pretending to listen, then I think immediately we make quite a lot of progress.
Yeah. What's the experience?
Yeah, I think spend time understanding, getting to know your colleagues as people, where they come from and what they can bring, and then you'll work much better together as a team. Bizarrely, a good crisis really brings a team together, so if you need to sort of...
So right now?
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, if you need to sort of manipulate that and create it as a team exercise, then do that. Just ways to really understand your colleagues.
Okay,
and
put fear
work.
into them. Okay. And
Yeah, and I think, Sarah made the point earlier about, preaching that they are different and bringing them into and having a discussion with them and them thinking that they might get fired, etc. If that's the case, then there's a lack of trust. And I think if you recognise those differences and you want to do something about it, you have to build trust with those individuals or that population. And just bear in mind, that's going to take some time. And the way they feel is not going to come out in a survey because people won't tell you how they really feel. Build trust and then be very, very purposeful about what you're trying to achieve. Have an objective.
Okay, so we are running out of time. So last comment of this is thank you for the most thought-provoking session of the conference. So well done, everyone. And just, I want you to leave the audience with one thing. So really quick fire. What do you want them to go away and do tomorrow?
Suspend disbelief, have a look at the guide, and think about whether you are the best board you can be to deliver excellent member outcomes.
Sarah?
When you're recruiting, chuck out the CV application form and think completely differently about how you're going to select the people that you need.
Set an objective, and if it's not recruiting, then it has to be retention. What's your target?
So you get the last word, go for it.
Just go out committed to learn and be prepared to question what we see as the status quo at all times, and just be prepared to go behind that and then work out what you can do once you've learned to make a genuine difference.
Thank you. Thank the panel, and welcome up onto the stage Emma and Jamie as we start a new discussion about is democracy safe in the digital age. So thank you everyone.